Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. John Cook.
Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook. This radio program is brought to you by the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. With me today is J. Chester Johnson, who has lived multiple lives. He's a critically acclaimed poet, essayist, and translator of over 4 decades. He's also been very active in the civil rights movement, served in President Jimmy Carter's Treasury Department, has a distinguished career in public finance, and played a major role in the retranslation of the Psalms contained in the Episcopal Church's Book of Common Prayer. And this latest work is perhaps one of his most significant nonfiction works, Auden, the Psalms, and Me. Mr. Johnson, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
I know that I have some groundwork thanks to my Methodist upbringing, but maybe we should have people understand a little bit. Let's start with liturgical religions like the Episcopal and the Anglican Church. How does the Book of Common Prayer fit into their weekly services?
Well, it's fundamental to their services. As you know, the Episcopal Church, or you may know, the Episcopal Church is the American branch of the Anglican Church. And the Anglican Church was created in the 16th century as part of the, when the Church of England broke away from the Catholic Church, or Church of England was created as the successor to the Catholic Church. And it was the Book of Common Prayer was compiled in 1549. It consisted of a lot of liturgy of the communion, the Eucharist, prayers, and also a body of psalms. Psalms having been taken from 1540 Great Bible of Miles Coverdale, and that constituted the Book of Common Prayer, and it pretty well stayed that way until 1662, when there were some modest changes, and then that 1662 version carried its way all the way, largely intact, into the 20th century, and then in the late 1960s and all through the 1970s, the Episcopal Church, as the American branch of the Anglican Church, decided that it needed a full revision, which the Book of Common Prayer needed a full revision, and they proceeded to make changes throughout the book, and that included a 12-year project that resulted in a complete retranslation of the Psalms, and I worked on this project for 8 years, from 1971 until the Psalms were completed and included in the new and in the current Book of Common Prayer. And then a very famous poet had served from 1968 until 1971, W.H. Auden, and coincidentally he was British, but spent most of his professional life here in the United States, but decided in 71 to return to England, and therefore I replaced him on the committee.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned that he's a poet, and you are too, and poetry plays a big part in the translation of the Psalms, doesn't it?
Oh, it does. I mean, the Psalms were poems. They were Hebrew poems, structured a little differently than the English, of course. But they were short poems. Well, they were reasonably short poems, except for Psalm 119, which goes on forever and ever. But at the time they were written, they had only a small number of beats per line, like 2 to 3 beats. That was the difference with Hebrew. But then when we translated them into English, because of the English ear and the American ear expecting longer lines, and we reflected that in the poems, the retranslated poems. And the other reason we we needed to lengthen them out a little bit, is that these psalms for the Episcopal Church are used for recitation or responsive readings in churches, and also for the chanting in the choirs, chanting in either Anglican chant or in plain song. So they needed to be musical in that way, and could accommodate both recitation of the entire congregation as well as singability.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure how many strands I can pull through here, but you mentioned that they were Hebrew originally, but a lot of the translations come from Latin and Greek versions as well, correct?
That's right. Mm-hmm. That's right. When the sort of the first diaspora, or the spreading of the Hebrews or Jews outside of Jerusalem and Judea, they spread through the middle, portions of the Middle East, and at that time the Greeks dominated that part of the world, and so there was a decision to translate all the Psalms into Septuagint, which is it means 70 scholars. And that was the first version. Then, as the Greeks were replaced by the Romans, then these Psalms became part of Old Latin. But there were so many versions of it that it just created all kinds of problems in terms of how one would use these Psalms. And so, in the 4th century, a pope by the name of Damasus asked Jerome, who eventually became Saint Jerome, to bring order to this process, and so Saint Jerome wrote the Vulgate Bible, which is sort of the more modern Latin, and the Psalms were part of that. And the person who then in turn translated the Psalms that became part of the Great Bible of 1540 and in turn became part of our Book of Common Prayer, named Miles Coverdale, he was particularly proficient in Latin, and he relied very heavily on the Vulgate, but he also knew Greek and he knew German, and he used the Lutheran Bible to some extent to do his translation. But he didn't know much of Hebrew, so what he was doing when he put it into the Great Bible of 1540 is he just relied on translations mostly, and a little bit on original, but mostly on translations. And he made a number of mistakes, and that was another reason for the retranslation of the Psalms, was not just the process of updating it, but also there were a lot of mistakes that he had made in the 1540 Bible, and so we attempted to correct those mistakes in our retranslation. Correct
me if I'm wrong, but isn't that translation the basis for the King James Version that's popularized now? Is it?
That's exactly right, Dr. Cook. That's exactly right. It was by the King James Version came out in 1611. And the Great Bible, as I said, had been put in effect in 1540. And the one thing that so many of the English people enjoyed were the Psalms, and because it was part of their, not only the Great Bible, but it was also, those Psalms were being used in their worship in the Anglican Church. So the translators, or those who compiled the King James Version, used Coverdale's Psalms as the source, the foundation, and made only slight adjustments in the in his Psalms to then go into the and they went into the largely those Psalms that were in the 1540 Great Bible.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk a little bit about the liturgy. I for 40 years in the Methodist Church, every Sunday recited the Nicene Creed, and we had our service of Holy Communion, our version of the Eucharist. And there are words I can still recite verbatim because of all those years of saying it that way.
Sure.
Part of the challenge that W.H. Auden faced with this committee that was rewriting was that he wanted to keep it more traditional. In fact, he even advocated for going back to Latin, didn't he?
Yeah, he was that. I'm laughing, but I mean he was deadly serious about his views. But very, you're right. But there's a certain common. You're mentioning Methodist Church. There's this commonality that existed between the Methodist Church and the Episcopal Church here in the United States. They almost merged back in 1790, and so there's a certain common liturgy that's part of it. But anyway, Auden's view about the return to Latin came, I think, largely from both of his grandfathers were Anglican clerics, and so he grew up with this high church view of what liturgy was, and the Reformations. I mean, for example, I'm sure Wesley would have very much opposed the idea of Latin, because when there was the translations moved from being in Latin into the vernacular, whether it was German or English during the time of the Reformation. The reason that was done that way is to sort of break down what was seen as a barrier between God and the person in the pew. So the person in the pew should understand what is going on, rather than most of the people didn't know Latin. But Auden's view was, somewhat of a, I don't mean it, but it's certainly intellectually elite view of, well, let's return to Latin, but his purpose of doing that was a little different. But it would have been I think it would have set back liturgy a few hundred years if we hadn't decided to do that.
Mm-hmm, very good. Yeah, and I wonder how many people who grew up with the Book of Prayer that they knew for 400 years are receptive to the one that was published in 79. Thinking about the Anglican versus the Episcopal Church, there might have been a significant divide across the ocean.
Yeah, there was, but it's a bit of an interesting story, because the Episcopal Church decided it needed to make these revisions, largely, particularly regarding the Psalms, because there were so many mistakes in it, and the language was so obsolete. So we went through the process of revising over a 12-year period, doing this retranslation. We had, a number of people adopted our version of the Psalms, and one was we became the approved version of for the Church of England. Mm-hmm. But then eventually they decided that it was time for them to come up with their own, because we do have a common. We're separated by a common language.
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
So they felt that there was a need. And there, if you read, and we're still an approved version, but we were the adopted, preferred version before they produced their own. And they produced their own in 2000, and they've been using that. But I can tell you for certain that they continue to use our version even today. I was in London a couple of years ago, and I was at a service, and I noticed that our Psalm 68 was in the church bulletin, and so afterwards I went up to the priest. I didn't realize so much of the background. Well, maybe it was 3 years ago, but anyway. The priest said, "Oh, we use the Episcopal version of the Psalms all the time. We're authorized to do it, and for a number of years it was the approved version. So I got in touch with a person who had been the chairman of the Psalter retranslation for the Church of England, and he and I had a very long discussion about this over by email, and in fact I included some of his comments in my book in terms of why they felt so comfortable using the Episcopal version of the Psalms.
I'm not sure that everyone is clear about how the Anglican Church got started with the first Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry VIII decided he needed that to happen so that he could divorce one wife to marry another.
Right. Well, what happened is that Henry VIII was just he was married to Catherine of Aragon, and she was not producing an heir, and he had asked permission to marry Catherine of Aragon because she had been previously married, and apparently he got approval to do that. He married her, and then he wanted to get rid of her and have and marry Anne Boleyn, whom he thought would be fertile for a male heir, as a result, the Catholic Church refused, or over time never gave him the approval to divorce Catherine of Aragon, and so he decided to set up his own church and to break away from the Catholic Church, and that's how the Church of England came into being. And the person who had worked on his divorce on his behalf on the continent, Thomas Cranmer, who was very much of a theologian and biblical scholar, became his Archbishop of Canterbury, and he was actually the one who put the book of compiled the Book of Common Prayer, So that was the book he put together in 1549, including the Psalms of Miles Coverdale.
Now, even though that's sort of the seminal part of the Anglican Church, Thomas Cranmer didn't fare very well because subsequent royalty was more Catholic than Anglican. Mary the First, of course, being an important figure, and Cranmer didn't fare well.
No, he didn't. No, he certainly didn't. He was Mary the First came in. She was Catholic. She followed Edward the Sixth. Edward the Sixth was physically very weak and a sickly person and didn't live very long. So it was during his reign, actually, after Henry VIII, that the Reformation really bloomed in England, and that's when the Church of England was truly established. And it was during that time, that during Edward VI, that the Book of Common Prayer was put together, etc., etc. But then, following Edward's death, then Mary the First, Bloody Mary they call her, came into place. They call her Bloody Mary because she had so many of the Reformationists killed, and she had Thomas Cranmer, who had been the Archbishop of Canterbury, burned at the stake in Oxford, but then she was followed by Elizabeth I, who reigned for a long time, and her sympathies were obviously toward the Church of England, and her adoption of the book that Cranmer had put together, and including the Psalms of Miles Coverdale. So that's sort of the the line of succession, but in fact, Miles Coverdale, who did the Psalms, would have been burned at the stake, no doubt, except the King of Denmark came to his defense and rescued him from England, but otherwise Miles would also have been killed.
I want to ask a couple of questions about the Eucharist, and especially Auden's interpretation, because, in all the years that I've practiced Holy Communion, we talk about transubstantiation versus consubstantiation, but the consumption of the elements of wine and bread, or representing the blood and body of Christ, is for the remission of sins. But Auden had it connected to the dead and the unborn somehow, and I didn't understand that.
Well, Auden relied on Charles Williams. Charles Williams was a theologian and writer, a little older than W.H. Auden, and he had this issue about time and eternity, that there was always a problem with time and eternity. And Auden had written a lot about this. I mean, in his poetry, he wrote the Christmas Oratorio, which is part of For the Time Being, to deal with the issue of time and eternity. And that we, as Christians, as we of people of spirituality, and not just limited to Christianity, also Judeo-Christian, had the issue of time versus eternity. And his idea was that if you somehow can squeeze time and eternity together and take actions where you reduce the difference between the two, then you are creating a more holy environment. And his idea was, and that had a lot to do with his choice of Latin for the Book of Common Prayer, that because Latin was a dead language, then it is more meaningful from a holy perspective, and in tying time and eternity together, you don't use a current language, use a dead language. And in turn, he said the Eucharist was linking the dead and the unborn, and that in itself, that there was this holy element of the Eucharist of bringing those two together. There's a moment of uplifting. It's a moment of eternity, and by celebrating that, as opposed to the spiritual aspect of what the Eucharist did, which the Reformationists didn't buy into that. But anyway, that was the idea that Auden had about bringing together the dead and the unborn. That's more of an act of eternity than if you're only concerned about those who are around the table or the altar at communion. Mm-hmm. And part of it, those in the Reformation really felt strongly that was not the purpose of the Eucharist, that the purpose of the Eucharist, it was a spiritual act that only the living could participate in. And in fact, it was really a rejection of that whole idea that was partially reiterated by Charles Williams and W.H. Auden. That was in the 16th century. The idea was getting away, because the Eucharist was partially in the Catholic Church seen as a way of moving the dead along more rapidly in purgatory toward heaven. Mm-hmm. So But the Reformation said, no, forget about the dead. This is for the living. It's an act of spirituality for the living, and it's not, this is not the actual body and blood of Christ. It is a spiritual act. It's not transubstantiation. It's it is a moment where the living is participating in the living alone in the sharing of the body and blood of Christ.
Very good, very good. And I want to return to poetry for just a moment, because this book reads like a who's who of English literature. I mean, you mentioned C.S. Lewis and T.S. Eliot and John Donne and William Shakespeare, and you mentioned Tolkien at one point. It's just full of names that everyone would recognize from their literature classes. And I think at one point you call the Psalms, the Psalter itself, the 150 of them, a congery of individual poems, a jumble of a disorderly collection of some sort.
Right. Yes, it is. But it is just a fascinating group of poems, though. I mean, I always loved the Psalms, and when I was very young, but it was this 8 years of spending so much time with them. I feel like I've gotten to know the poets. These are poets,
yes,
that put this together, and they had certain views, and for centuries we thought that David was certain people thought that David was responsible for writing these psalms, and we realized that maybe he's an author of a few, but as a general matter, it was, there were many poets who participated in this, and there's a certain DNA in every writer's verse, and so I think I got to feel for the variety of writers who participated in this group, which were, it was codified in around 500 BCE after the Hebrews came back from the Babylonian exile and felt that they needed to redeem themselves because they saw the Babylonian exile as punishment for not living up to the mitzvah, or the commandments of God, and prior to the Exodus, or the exile. Mm-hmm. And they came back, and that's when the Second Temple was built, and then they codified the worship book, which included the 150. Although probably there was some further codification after 500, including probably Psalm 119, which if I'd been around that time, they wouldn't have included 119. I wouldn't have wanted 119.
That one's the one that goes on and on and on. Yes.
Exactly.
Well, I too was fascinated by the Psalms from a very young age, and recited the 23rd Psalm a lot, and we called it the 23rd Psalm of David, of course.
Sure.
But this book kept me fascinated. I looked up things to make sure I was remembering history correctly, and I just was enamored of the story and the way you weaved in so much wisdom, both of Auden and others, for what has become the common book of prayer. Unfortunately, we're out of time. The book is Auden, the Psalms, and Me. It's by J. Chester Johnson. It's a fascinating read. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. I remind you, if you don't hear our regularly scheduled broadcast, you can catch us on on YouTube at Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook. Thanks for listening.